Welcome to the third Sunday program again, everyone. Very lovely to see you back now for the Dhamma talk. And before I begin, I want to go ahead and pay homage to the Buddha, because even though we just did it, there's no harm in doing it again. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. This evening, what I'd like to talk about is the intuitive mind. This is the area that I would like to see if we can explore something about the intuitive mind. And in order to do that, I'm going to tell you a story to start out with and see if that is some kind of an example or a pointer at exactly what kind of mind we're talking about tonight. So the story starts in Japan, in Obama, Japan. Some of you know that I trained there when I first became a nun years ago, and I was just recently ordained, and I was in the garden, and the whole crew was in the garden. Usually, when we did work, most of the people did the work together. It was like one large crew, and then occasionally a couple of people in the kitchen. And one person at the front desk, but the rest of the monastics all tended to kind of clump together. And so we were all in the garden there, and I had been asked to pick chamomile flowers to make tea. So this was a first for me. I'd never really made tea from scratch like that, let alone chamomile tea. And so I was seated on a little kind of like a step stool thing in front of this bush of German chamomile. And I have a photo of it actually on my computer. So if folks are curious about that, we can look at it later. But anyway, it's a bush and it was in full bloom. So, maybe it has 150 or more, hundreds of these tiny, tiny little white flowers with a yellow center. That's what chamomile looks like. And this German chamomile, and the stems of the German chamomile are like a hair's, width, basically, these tiny, tiny, tiny little stems. And the whole bush is like this, just one big clump of flowers. And so there I was sitting in front of the chamomile bush, and I had been asked by Shodo. Shodo is the German monk who did most of the translation into English, from Japanese to English, as well as Japanese to German, there in the monastery during the periods, the couple of years that I was training there. And Shodo was also the head of the garden, and so he had asked me to do this picking of these flowers. And so there I was picking flowers. And at some point, I started to get a little bit concerned or like wondering, usually in the Japanese monastery, there's very, very specific instructions about how to do everything, like quite specific. So for example, if you were in the kitchen and somebody handed you a carrot and said, cut this into matchsticks, they would hand you a matchstick so that you could match it up to the little pieces of carrot that you were going to cut. So I was sitting there in front of the chamomile bush and thinking, gosh, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. So I called out to Shodo and I said, Shodo-san, So that's how we address people politely. It means kind of like Mr. Shodo or like Bante Shodo, if we were to say it in Theravada style. Shodo-san, and I was Konin-san at that point in time, was what I went by. And I said, Shodo-san, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be picking like just the flowers that are fully opened, or is it okay to pick the buds? And what about the ones that the petals are already starting to fall off? And there are these ones, these little yellow centers where the whole all the petals have fallen off, but is the yellow part the part that tastes good? I don't really know. I've never done this before. And Shoto-san looked over at me from the other side of the garden and he said, "Are you asking me when a flower becomes a flower?" And there was a pause there for a moment, and I thought about it for a second, and I said, "Well, maybe." Maybe that's what I'm asking. And so how did Shoto-san respond? He just shook his head. He just shook his head. And he refused to answer, refused to say anything. Just no way. Just no answer. And so I went back to picking, the flowers that I thought were appropriate to make tea. I just kind of, did what I thought was appropriate. And it took me a while before I realized that what Shoda was pointing to, intentionally or unintentionally, frankly, but what Shoda was really pointing to was he was pointing to the mind. And specifically the knowing mind, the intuitive mind, the mind that doesn't need to make a diagram or count petals or know the scientific name of the German chamomile bush or anything like that. Right? He's pointing to the mind that already intuitively knows when the flower becomes a flower. So the question is, what aspect of mind is that? What kind of mind is that? And how would we go about experiencing that without having to go to Japan and talk to the German monk about it? Right? So it's an intuitive approach, and it's an approach that sees the difference between the conceptual and some other kind of knowing, right? So it's a kind of mind that is receptive, right? It's a kind of mind that isn't clinging to a particular idea about flower or how to count petals. It's a kind of mind that is the space in which the thoughts might arise, but it's bigger than the thoughts. And it's a kind of mind that can know itself. It can observe itself, but it can also just drop off that kind of self observation and be completely immersed in the object itself, the thing that we're experiencing. So, this is what I'm referring to as the knowing mind. Knowing mind. And if we had to put a label on, so now this is a talk about intuitive mind, and what I'm suggesting is an intuitive approach. And nonetheless, I'm going to go ahead and give you a label for it so that we can talk about it together. But if we had to fit it into a kind of framework or a language framework, this is vijnana. This is vijnana, the consciousness. Consciousness. Okay, known as the fifth of the five khandas or aggregates. And that word vijnana is it has this nya in the middle. You notice this? It has a, like, if some of you may know Spanish or have seen Spanish written, you'd see they have the N with the little tilde at the top, the ñe. That's in Spanish, it's called ñe. So vijnana has two ñes in the middle. And that's because it's related to the Sanskrit root of nya. So nya is spelled J, N with a little tilde, and A with a long A. So it's a funky word. We wouldn't see it that way in Pali. So Pali is a much more simplified, um, in the mouth kind of language. But we have many words in Pali that are related to this root, the Sanskrit root nya, which means to know or to see. Right? So we have jnana, which is a kind of knowing, and we have vijnana, which is consciousness, and we have parinyaya, which means to know well. We have various other words that go with this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this also. Janati is also related. So, and one reason to start to explore this kind of mind, I would propose, is because when we're looking at the mind of thoughts and the mind of concepts and the mind of diagrams and counting petals, that tends to reinforce the sense of separation. That tends to reinforce the sense of self and a distinction between us and the object. Whereas a knowing mind can be, as I said, sort of immersed in the object or sort of, or one with, perceive its oneness with the object and discover something about the nature of experience which doesn't have this sense of separation to it. So one question is, again, sort of how to find this mind or how to experience this kind of thing. Mm. In a very mundane way, how to approach it. Just even approach it. Mm. And so what I want to talk about also today is a little bit about the nonverbal mind. How we come to know a little bit about the nonverbal mind. So one way that we can approach the nonverbal mind, and we see a lot of this in all of the different Buddhist traditions that I've been a part of, is we see these various ways of stretching to the knowing mind, of becoming, of approaching the knowing mind, knowing itself. One way is through poetry. So that's still verbal, but poetry invites a way in which the mind is sort of filling in more than what's literally there on the page, right? This is one of the beautiful attributes of poetry. So I'll give you an example of that. It's a one of my favorite poems by one of my favorite poets, Ryokan. Ryokan, 18th century Japanese poet. Yeah, 18th century. And he was very much a pilgrim and kind of a hermit and various things. And he wrote all different kinds of poetry, not necessarily just haiku, but there's this one very short one, which I believe probably was a haiku before it came into English. And he says this, he says, "Left behind by the thief, the moon in the window. Left behind by the thief, the moon in the window." And you see how the mind then fills in this imagery, right? Of moon and window, and perhaps Ryokan in his hut. And who's this thief? Oh, curiosity there, right? So there's a way in which there's a whole story told with in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 words. Mm, 10 words. So we have examples of various kinds of poetry that invite a kind of knowing mind. And still we can move even further away from the verbal, right? And begin to look at other ways of interacting with the mind. So another aspect of moving away from the verbal is the way that we use instruments in Buddhism. Yeah. So we ring the bell to tell you to come back to the hall without having to tell you, come back to the hall. We just ring the bell, right? And perhaps the one ringing gets an opportunity to stand there and be embodied and be a part of ringing fully. And perhaps you listening can also stand or sit there and be fully a part of ringing. And another approach is through art. So Buddhist art has taken all sorts of forms. The, the lovely Buddha Rupa, that's what we call the statue, the form, Buddha form behind me. I don't know if you can see the Deva over there with her little, can you see the Deva? With her little flute. Recently, in the last couple of years, I've taken up watercolor painting, which happened because of some experiences on the cushion that opened up this whole floodgate of creativity for me. And then this year, during the winter retreat, I was thinking about this instruction from the Buddha, in which the Buddha says, "See the danger of unwholesome states of mind." See the danger of unwholesome states of mind. And I thought, oh, well, how about if I literally could see the danger of unwholesome states of mind? And so I started painting them. So I'm just going to share a couple of them with you just for fun. So, like, this is a painting of the danger of anger. This is a painting of the danger of anger, right? And this very hot, messy energy up here. And then it coagulates and it forms this hardening, this rock formation, if it's allowed to get so heavy that it pools here in the bottom below the heart, at the bottom of the heart. So that was one about anger. And then I did this one about restlessness. So this is restlessness. And the dark bars are the nights and the light bars are the days. So this represents time. And this is the present moment, these lovely flowers. And then this is representing how restlessness is dragging me into the future, out of my present moment, and destroying my experience of these lovely flowers by dragging me into the future across time. Restlessness. So this has become a very fun way for me to tap into a non-verbal mind and a more intuitive form of the mind, right? And in Tibetan tradition, for example, we have these gorgeous mandalas, right? Or we have images of great teachers. You can stand there and look in the eyes of a great teacher on these beautiful tankas, right? Or some depiction of the cosmos, like just like that. You can look and see somebody's explanation of the entire Buddhist cosmology right there on the wall, right? Without a word. that a word? And then there's movement, right? And then there's the body. So the Buddha very classically said, if we want to know the mind in the 4 foundations of mindfulness, he says, well, you start first of all by knowing the body. And then by knowing the body, then you could come to know feelings, and you could come to know mind, and you could come to know dhammas, various attributes or states of mind or quality of being. So for this reason, we get up off our cushion and do walking meditation. Totally simple. Allow the mind to be at your feet. Just walking. Just walking. And even if thoughts are streaming through, there's just walking. There's just the foot touching the ground, leaving the ground, touching the ground again. So simple. So simple. So looking at this relationship between mind and body, we can begin to experience something about the mind without words, about consciousness itself. Because consciousness is the knowing that knows the foot touching the ground, right? It's the container for that perceptual experience to arise, the space of awareness in which there is a contact, and then that contact, whether it's bodily or whether it's another thought, that contact then, it's in this larger, much more vast, open knowing. So when we're paying attention to the foot, we can open the awareness a bit and say, oh, what is it that knows the foot? Without all those words, we can just turn the attention around to the thing that's knowing the foot. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with words, actually, right? There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I was recently reading an article. I'll read you a little bit of just a couple of lines from Venerable Analayo's article about this last year. He wrote an article about the knowing mind and the relationship between sampajanya, knowing well, sampajanya, and or knowing with clarity, clearly knowing. All of those are ways that it's translated, that word sampajanya, and sati, and mindfulness. And he says this, he says, the role of clear knowing is to furnish the comprehension of what one is experiencing. And it's due to the clarity of that knowing. Now, I'm paraphrasing very slightly his words here. Due to the clarity of that knowing, that understanding, that one is able to say to oneself, oh, I'm aware that I feel such and such a thing. I'm aware that I feel my foot, or that I have a certain Vedana arising, a certain pleasant or unpleasant tone, or any other perception that's happening. And then he goes on and he says, and then the role of clear knowing evolves to become penetrative and thereby productive of wisdom. And this is why we see so many words and so many descriptions of this kind, of this, with this root of knowing throughout the discourses, because it plays this very important role in understanding and in transforming understanding all the way through to wisdom. And we can experience this kind of mind, this knowing mind, on the cushion as well. We can experience it in the meditation, whether our meditation is on the cushion or on the bench or on the chair or lying down or standing up. So one example that I sometimes use is the end of the metta meditation or the end of any of the Brahma Viharas. So if you do that radiating form where you have you're allowing the light of loving kindness to flow outward in all directions. And then at some point, when you've come to what you perceive to be the end of that meditation, then you can allow the fading away of that light of the Brahma Vihara, just letting that light just slowly quiet down and fade away, and then observe. Then what's left? When the light of metta or the light of karuna fades away, what's left? It's a beautiful thing to explore. What abides in the space left behind by the metta? Or another discourse in which we see this kinds of description of the mind are the discourses of the boundless meditations, the so-called formless meditations. And there's one in particular which is in the shorter discourse on emptiness. And I just want to share a little bit of an outline of that, not that we're going to do it together, but just to talk through where it's taking us. And before that, I also want to say two things. One is that sometimes that discourse is understood as progressing through the jhanas and then to the formless meditations. But in my experience, and I think I'm very much leaning toward Venerable Analayo's experience as well, his description of it, which is that the jhanas are not necessary, actually. They're not a prerequisite in order to experience those formless meditations that are described in the shorter discourse on emptiness. Because where it starts is it starts with a very kind of mundane perception. And it's the Buddha and Venerable Ananda in Megara's mother's house. And they're in Megara's mother's house, and he says, okay, now look around and notice that there are no elephants here. So you too could look around your house and notice that there are no elephants there. Right? For the most part, I think for most of you, that's going to be true. Right? And so he says, okay, now noticing that, then what is here? And he says, okay, so what is here is the Sangha. The Sangha of monks is present here in Megara's mother's house. There's you and me and a group of other monastics. Okay, so that's the setup. The setup is to become aware of what's not present and to become aware of what is present. Right? So then he goes from there and he says, okay, then we look at, and this is very important, the oneness or the unification of the perception of forest. So instead of looking at the forest as individual trees, we look at the forest as a whole, the forest as a oneness, and we perceive it that way. So it's about sanya, also a word that comes from this same root of knowing, perception is how I translate it in English, sanya, which is the third of the khandhas. So we have this perception of the oneness of forest, and we see, oh, okay, so what's present is that. And then what's absent is we don't see the people anymore. We're just seeing the wholeness of the forest as one thing. And then we move from there to the wholeness of earth element. This is why we did the elements earlier. We move from that to the perception of oneness of the earth element filling the consciousness, the whole oneness of the earth. And then you go from there, and this is where there's a bit of a leap. Then you go from there to boundless space. So again, so now we're in a completely mental space of mental perception of the oneness of boundless space, similar to a Brahma Vihara. That's why they go together. And then the next one is boundless consciousness. So the perception of the oneness of limitless consciousness. Right there in your meditation. And that is a space that's without words. It's a space that's it's a knowing kind of mind. But then after that, interestingly, where the sutta goes, so there are a couple more meditations on other formless, boundless states. And then at the end, the Buddha says, and then one reflects on that and one knows, even that subtle state of mind is volitional. It's based on a condition. It's based on the presence of this life. It's based on the intention of being in that space, of being then in that kind of a meditation. And because it's volitional, then it's also impermanent and subject to cessation. And that's where you unlock the freedom. That's where you unlock the insight. But it all starts with a very basic, very, very basic knowing mind, nonverbal mind, in which the verbal mind is happening. Do you see the distinction that I'm making there? So ultimately, what I'm saying is that by knowing the body and the connection between the mind and the body, and beginning to investigate that mind that knows, supported by these kinds of intuitive endeavors like art or poetry or walking meditation or becoming one with the sound, then you can begin to see consciousness itself and the attributes of consciousness itself. So thank you. That's all I wanted to share tonight. And I will go ahead and turn off the recording so that people can feel comfortable asking whatever questions come to mind. Yes, Elizabeth, hold on one second. Let me just get this recording turned